In this video, we're going to look at the basic or parent functions. And so let's go ahead and get started. Now, if you look at the first one here, y is equal to x. This is called the identity function because x and y are the same. So every point on this graph has the same x and y values. So you can see 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, and so on. However, you notice this is of the form y equals mx plus b, which we know that makes it a linear equation, and we can see that it's a line. And here we have a slope of 1 over 1, or 1, and our y-intercept is 0. So start at 0, go up 1, right 1. So this is just a line, and we already know how to graph lines, so I'm not really going to talk about the identity function other than you should know how to graph y equals x. But we can do that because we know how to graph lines. There's going to be four that we're going to focus on here, particularly in this chapter. So it'd be this one here, this one, and down here when we get to absolute value. So at least for this first test that we'll be having, those are the four that you need to know. So these are the functions we need to be familiar with or be able to graph really quickly. We've graphed y equals x squared or quadratic functions before. All we did was make a table of values, and that's what we do when we run into a new type of function that we're not familiar with. So if you choose 0, x squared, 0 squared, that'd be 0. You can see that's the point here. If you put in 1, 1 squared is 1, and that's this point here. If you put in 2, of course 2 squared will give you 4, and again you can see 2, 4, that's this point here. We learned that if we plug in -1 and -2, because we're squaring, we end up with the same thing that we got when we plugged in 1 and 2. -1 squared, or -1 times -1, is 1. And -2 squared, -2 times -2, is 4. And so these are the 5 points that I want you to know for this graph. And what you're going to find as we move forward is we'll start with these graphs, and with transformations, we'll do something to the graph depending on the transformation. But we've got to start by knowing how to graph y equals x squared. And so these are the 5 points I would want you to know. 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 4, -1, 1, and -2, 4. So for the square root function, there's one more comment I wanted to make here. This is the squaring function. We know it's a parabola or U-shaped. All right, square root of x. So if we plug in 0, the square root of 0 is 0. If we plug in 1 for x, the square root of 1 is 1. Now we could use 2, but the square root of 2 is not a nice number. You need your calculator to find that. Same with the square root of 3. But notice if you plug in 4, the square root of 4 would be 2. And so you can see those are the 3 points on this graph. Notice there's nothing when x is negative because we can't take the square root of a negative number. That would be an imaginary number. And we've talked about this when we're graphing, we're dealing with all real numbers. I always say keep it real when you're graphing. All right? So these are the 3 points we need to know for the square root function, or the graph of y equals the square root of x. And I call this the ET function. You may remember ET had a long finger, or you may not be familiar with ET, but we call this the ET function. So you don't really have to know the names, but for some students it helps them to remember the functions. All right, let's move on to the cubing function, or y equals x cubed. So again, I want to state what I said earlier before I get into this one here. For the square root function, these are the 3 points we need to know. And by the way, you can see that 2 of the points are on our squaring function. So this is the only one that's different. But again, this is our ET function. All right, let's go on to x cubed. So if we plug in 0, 0 cubed is 0. There's your 0.00. If you plug in 1, 1 cubed is 1. If you plug in 2, 2 cubed is 8, and there's that point. So there's these 3 points we just found. And if you plug in -1, -1 cubed is -1 times -1 times -1. You should get -1 there. And if you cube -2, you get -8. So you can see -1, -1 is on the graph, and -2, -8. So this is what I call the John Travolta graph. And just hold on just a second here. Just in memory of John there and his dance, which is where I get this shape. All right. I'll have to show you in class a little bit more about the John Travolta, but it's kind of an S-shaped type of graph. It doesn't look like an S, but it's the same idea. But I call that the John Travolta. And again, you can see that 0, 0, and 1, 1 are on the graph just like they were on the last, really on all the graphs so far. And then we do have this point here, but then you have their negatives. And so those are the 5 points you need to know for y equals x cubed, or my John Travolta graph. Now, hold on a sec. Let me see if I can make this just a little better looking. There we go. So y equals cube root of x is a graph that you would get in a very similar way. It's kind of basically backwards the way this graph is. Our x and y values are the opposite. Let's move on to the absolute value function. This is one we'll see on occasion, but so it's good to have on the sheet here, but you won't see it as much. You wouldn't see it on the test. Y equals the absolute value of x. So if you were making a table for that, and we've done this, we saw that it was V-shaped. Oops, I need to move this down just a little bit. There we go. If we plug in 0, the absolute value of 0 is 0. The absolute value of 1, that's all we're doing here. Remember, absolute value is distance from 0, so we know it's always positive. So whether we take the absolute value of 1 or -1, either case we get 1. So let's go ahead and do 2, 2 as well. And you can see you've got 0, 0, 1, 1, and 2, 2. So it actually looks like the graph of y equals x until x is negative. Because if you take the absolute value of -1, we said that was 1, and the absolute value of -2 is 2. And so those are the 5 points that we have on this graph. And you'll notice that they're similar to the points we have on the squaring function. These 3 points here are also on this graph here. But again, this is V-shaped versus U-shaped. So this is where things get different. And you can see this is a pointed vertex versus the other one, which is rounded. So that's the 5 points that you would want to know, or those are the 5 points that you would want to know for the absolute value function. And finally, this one here is the reciprocal function, and I think you'll see 1 or 2 problems in the homework, and so you can use this to help you, but we're going to focus on that function later on when we talk about rational functions. So again, it's most important that you're real comfortable with the squaring function, the cube or the square root function, the cubing function, and the absolute value function, and get to know these graphs well enough that you can come up with these 5 points, or in the case of the square root function, 3 points. Alright, so that's it for this video on the basic functions.